Class 99 on the Golden Doves, page 52. We're dealing with the concept of repetition, shana, to repeat in Hebrew, but also means to change. So when there's a transmission, there is a further development of that which is being transmitted by the next generation, right? So in rabbinic tradition, bottom of page 52, a text is a composition designed for transmission, and therefore it involves repetition. So what is a text? So any text, at least in Hebrew thinking, is actually a linguistic it's a formulation of words put together in a very specific manner. And those words are meant to be transmitted. So it could be that I'm writing a book, it's a formulation of words, and I'm transmitting it to the public that will now read the book, right? So that's a text. That's how we define text, right? Now, obviously, if I'm transmitting the book, if I just wrote a book and I'm transmitting it to the public to read it, they're going to repeat the words. So I wrote the words, I thought them, I wrote them. When they read them, they're going to be repeating the words. Indeed, the Mishnah. So we have, for example, the Mishnah is a text. It's an oral text, but it's nevertheless a text. It's a text because it's a formulation of words carefully put together, very carefully, very precisely, right? But it was meant to be transmitted. So that's a Mishnah. The word Mishnah comes from the word Shana. Shana means to repeat, but it means to change. So, right, because the Mishnah would be repeated, right? The Tanna would repeat the Mishnah. So the word Mishnah designates the authoritative formulation of the oral law, right? So the Mishnah refers to, because there was no official text of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, but then came to Rabbi Akiva, and then later on to Benu HaKadosh, and they formulated a precise text. Everybody had to follow that text in the transmission of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. So that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is that which is meant to be shanun, which is meant to be repeated, right? The same text in the masculine form, the same term in the masculine form, Mishneh. We also have, what is the masculine form of the word Mishnah? It's very interesting. The masculine form of the word Mishnah is Mishneh. That's really great. So you have Mishneh Torah, right? The Mishneh Torah, or you have the Mishnah. So those are the same words. One is feminine, the other is masculine. So the same term in the masculine form, Mishneh, is found twice in the scriptures. The word Mishneh is found in the book of Melachim, he brings, and the book of Divrei Hayamim, in passages that, according to the Aramaic translation and traditional commentators, mean house of study. So it refers to the place they were looking for Huldah Nevi'ah, and she was in the Mishneh. So the Bet Midrash was referred to as a Mishneh. It's amazing. Why would the Bet Midrash be referred to as Mishneh? Because that's a place where you repeat the official transmissions, the official text of Israel. That's why Mishneh. That's amazing. What a name for a Bet Midrash, a Mishneh, right? Before considering the repetition, text, study, association, right? So in our minds, a text is to be studied, is to be transmitted, right? And that happens in the Mishneh. We must examine the expression Mishneh Torah, second to the Torah, found twice in the scriptures, in Devarim and in Yehoshua, right? In Devarim, let me open up the pasuk. It's with the Melech. V'chatav Mishneh Torah hazot al sefer. But let me open up the pasuk. And then Yehoshua, it's with respect to the Avanim, that they wrote the Sefer Torah or Mishneh Sefer Torah on the Avanim. So first, I'm going to open up the pasuk in Devarim. So every individual has an obligation, every male has an obligation to write a Sefer Torah. But in the case of the king, there's an obligation to write a Sefer Torah as the king, right? The Pasuk says, so the king, once he sits on his throne, will write et Mishneh HaTorah Hazot. He will write the Mishneh Torah on Sefer. Interesting. So in the book of Yoshua, it says, V'yichtov Sham al ha'avanim, when they cross the Jordan River, because Parashat Kitavo says that when they enter the land of Israel, they will have to write the Mishneh Torah on the stones. So here in Yoshua, when they actually cross the river, it says, or after they cross, it says, V'yichtov Sham al ha'avanim et Mishneh Torat Moshe. He wrote on the stones the Mishneh of the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, Asher Katav Lifnei Bnei Israel. So continuing in the text, traditional commentators were divided as to the exact sense of the expression, of this expression. On the basis of the verse in Deuteronomy, some maintain that it means the book of Deuteronomy, right? So what does it mean, Mishneh Torah Hazot? So Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, on the pasuk in Yoshua, which says that Yoshua wrote V'yichtov Sham al ha'avanim et Mishneh Torat Moshe, he says that the word Mishneh Torah refers to the book of Devarim, which the word Mishneh Torah does sometimes refer to the book of Devarim. So he says that Joshua wrote the book of Devarim on the stones. The verse in question, referring to the king, states, but just let's look at the book of Devarim, and with respect to the Misvat Aseh of the king to write the Sefer Torah, the pasuk says, when he is seated on his royal throne, he shall write for himself a Mishneh of this Torah, et Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, in a book from before the Levitical priests, because the Kohanim were in charge of the Sefer Torah, because the Sefer Torah was in the Aron HaKodesh, so they would use the Sefer Torah and the Aron HaKodesh to write the other Sefer Torah. So then when the king would write his Sefer Torah, it was Milifnei HaKohanim Alviim. Just wanted to explain that point. The identification of Mishneh Torah with the book of Deuteronomy takes Mishneh of this Torah to mean this Mishneh Torah. Right? Because if you look at the book of Devarim says, V'chatab lo et Mishneh HaTorah Hazot. It says the Mishneh of this Torah, Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, right? It doesn't say Mishneh Torah, right? It says Mishneh HaTorah Hazot. Whereas the pronoun this, Hazot, serves to indicate the book of Deuteronomy. So according to Abarbanel, Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, Zot, that refers specifically to the book of Deuteronomy. That's the way Abarbanel understands the pasuk. Again, I don't think I said it clearly. I'm going to repeat it. In the case of the king, it says, this Mishneh Torah should be written. So Abarbanel explains this to indicate the book of Deuteronomy. Right. There are two serious difficulties with this interpretation, with the interpretation of Abarbanel. To begin with, the Hebrew text uses a feminine pronoun, zot, this, right? Therefore, it must refer to the Torah, which is feminine, rather than to Mishneh, which is masculine. That's great. Wow, that's just great. Based upon grammar, my father shows that, and we love, of course, the Yitzhak Abarbanel. He was really one of the greatest in so many different ways. So, shalom. But we have to look for the emet. If you look at the pasuk, it says Mishneh Torah Hazot. This Mishneh Torah. This can't be referring to the Mishneh. It would be a Mishneh Torah Hazeh. It's not referring to the Mishneh, right? It's referring to the Torah. The Torah is Lashon Nekeva, right? Right. So grammatically, what the king writes, Torah Hazot, this Torah he writes, right? Not the Mishneh of the Torah, right? Which would be the book of Devarim, right? Because the book of Devarim is referred to as a Mishneh of the Torah, but that's not what the king writes. He himself is writing a repetition of the Torah, meaning the same way the book of Devarim is in a sense a repetition of the Torah, right? He's writing a repetition of the Torah. He's not writing the repetition that Moshe Rabbeinu gave in the 40th year of the desert. He's writing his own repetition of the Torah, which means the entire Sefer Torah, right? That's a Mishneh Torah Hazot. It's great. That's just great. Moreover, in the passage in Joshua, it is said that upon entering the Holy Land, the Israelites wrote the Mishneh of the Torah of Moses on stone. So let's look now at the pasuk in Yehoshua, right? Perek Chet pasuk was pasuk Lamed Bet. Vayichtov sham al ha'avanim et Mishneh Torat Moshe. He writes the Mishneh Torat Moshe on the stones. Okay. As many commentators observed, it is highly improbable that they would have written on stone a composition of the length of Deuteronomy. I mean, that's a lot to write on the stones, right? So that's a hard one. Meaning the explanation of the Yitzhak Abarbanel as a practical matter is a bit odd. Accordingly, Saadia Gaon explained that the Israelites only inscribed a summary of the principal laws. They wrote a summary, a new rendition of the Torah, meaning they wrote a summary of the principal laws of the Torah. So you see that when you refer to the Mishneh Torah, you can refer to the Mishneh Torah, which is the Mishneh of the Torah, which would be the book of Devarim. But there are different repetitions of the Torah. So you can have, in the case of the book of Yehoshua, Rabbeinu Saadia says, how do you repeat the Torah? By summarizing the principal laws of the Torah. And that's what they put on the stones. The Tarag Mitzvot were written down on the stones. When the king writes the Torah, he's repeating the Torah. And again, it's a Mishneh Torah in the sense that he's repeating the Torah. But in that case, he writes a repetition of the entire Torah, because there's Mishneh Torah Hazot, right? The actual Sefer Torah, and therefore the repetition is just rewriting the Sefer Torah, right? And that's why Harambam brings the law. He has to write an entire Sefer Torah. In addition to the regular Sefer Torah that we all have to write, the king has to write a Sefer Torah, a personal Sefer Torah for himself that he carries with him. Okay. So again, accordingly, Saadia Gaon explained that the Israelites only inscribed a summary of the principal laws. There's a very interesting footnote here, footnote 20, in page 165. I'm going to read it. Cited by the Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. He's the one who brings it, Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, which explains that in the book of Yehoshua, what he wrote on the stones was a summary of the Torah, meaning the actual mitzvot, the Tarag mitzvot. All right. The objection raised by Aharon ibn Sargado Gaon cited that since the scriptures specified all the words of this Torah, right? That's in the book of Devarim, Perek Kaf Zayin Pasuk Gimel. So if you look at Parashat Kitavon, Perek Kaf Zayin Pasuk Gimel, where it brings the mitzvah to write the words of the Torah on the stones, let's read that pasuk now. You should run on these stones after you cross the Jordan River. All the words of this Torah. So based on this, Ibn Salgado, alav shalom, Ibn Salgado Gaon, alav shalom, objects to the explanation of Ibn Salgado Gaon, that since the scriptures specified all the words of the Torah, so it says, then how can you say it's only a Mishneh of the Torah? Namely, in the case of Rabbeinu Salgado Gaon, he would say only the 630 mitzvot, right? It cannot be a summary. My father says this is a representative character of the Mishneh. Because remember we said that the Mishneh represents the king. It's not the king, but it represents the king. So the whole idea of Mishneh, second to, right? That's what this means, right? According to the Rebbeinu Salgado Gaon, it says, you write those words through a Mishneh. And that's why in the book of Yoshua, it says that it was done through a Mishneh, meaning it's not speculation. Yoshua did it through a Mishneh. So Yoshua understood that when it says to write the Divrei HaTorah Hazot, it didn't mean to write every single word of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim, to like Le'anei kol Yisrael, right? But rather a Mishneh. So what's the Mishneh of the Torah? So comes Rabbeinu Salgado Gaon and explains the Mishneh of the Torah, a summary or a secondary representation of the Torah, would be the actual Tanakh Mitzvot. Similarly, the objection of Rabbi Shemuel Lanyado Keli Yakar, that Joshua, another great Chacham, Halabi Chacham, one of the really great Perushim of the Tanakh, he writes that Joshua could not have written such a summary, since the scripture says that Moses wrote before the children of Israel. So if you look at the pasuk in Yehoshua, it says, "Vayichtov sham al ha'avanim et mishneh Torat Moshe," but then it continues, "Asher katav lifnei bnei Israel," that he wrote in front of the Jewish people. So mishneh. So he says, what does it mean? Asher katav lifnei bnei Israel, that Moses wrote before the children of Israel, and based upon that, the Keli Yakar says, this can't be like Rabbeinu Salgado Gaon, because it says Asher Katav Lifnei Bnei Israel, that Moses wrote before the Jewish people. When Moses wrote before the Jewish people, is the words of the Torah, not the Tanakh Mitzvot. This is mistaken, says my father. The relative pronoun Asher determines the term Torah, not Mishneh. Asher Katav Lifnei Bnei Israel means the Torah that was written before the Jewish people, not the Mishneh Torah that was written before the Jewish people. So Vayichtov sham al ha'avanim et Mishneh Torat Moshe. So Keli Yakar says, and this Mishneh Torat Moshe was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. No, it's a Torah that was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. So we're writing a Mishneh of the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote before the Jewish people. Very subtle point. I think it was worth reading the footnote, right? But just to explain, a relative pronoun, Asher is a relative pronoun because a relative pronoun refers to a noun or pronoun that preceded it. And what it does, it provides more information about that noun or pronoun. For example, you say, the man who is wearing the blue suit, who is a relative pronoun, right? And it provides more information about the preceding, namely the man, right? So here, the relative pronoun is Asher, Katav Lifnei Bnei Israel. This, the preceding pronoun, not the Mishneh, the Torah Moshe, right? That Torah Moshe is the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote before the Jewish people, right? Because if it was Mishneh, then it would be like Abarbanel. Because what did Moshe Rabbeinu write before the Jewish people? So you would say the Mishneh Torah, you would say, okay, the book of Devarim, then you say Asher Katav, so therefore he's just rewriting the book of Devarim, right? That's how Rabbeinu will explain it. But again, as noted, there were some difficulties with that explanation, right? Therefore, the correct translation is the Mishneh of the Torah that Moses wrote before all of Israel. Right. All right. That's then to footnote 20. Going back to the text. Both views agree that Mishneh is a summary. So everybody agrees the word Mishneh is a summary, right? Repetition, a summary. The controversy only concerns whether the summary is of the book of Deuteronomy or of some other composition. The question is, what are you summarizing? Are you summarizing the book of Devarim? Are you summarizing the Ten Commandments, as Abarbanel says on Yoshua, right? What are you summarizing? The precise meaning of this term will be obvious upon noting that it is parallel to the expression Mishneh LaMelech, implying therefore identity, alterity with the original, right? So you remember we explained Mishneh LaMelech, the representative of the king, but the full one representative of the king who represents the king and has the authority of the king, but he is not the king, right? On the one hand, a summary of the original is not identical to it. So a Mishneh, by definition, is not the Melech. So the summary of the Torah, by definition, is not the Torah. On the other hand, since it contains the principal laws, it can effectively represent the authority of the Torah. And now we understand the Omek of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, the Mishneh, the summary of the Torah, namely the Tariag Mitzvot, is a representation of the Torah, right? It's a representation of the Torah. The sense of the passage in Deuteronomy is that the king should order a summary of the Torah to be written for him under the supervision of the Levitical priests. The book of Deuteronomy itself, since it contains the principal laws of the Pentateuch, is a Mishneh Torah, but it is not the only such Mishneh. So while it is correct that the book of Devarim is a Mishneh Torah because it is a summary of the laws in the preceding four books, but it's not the only Mishneh. That's why Rambam wrote the Mishneh Torah, right? Because it's a summary of the laws of the Torah. As Saadia Gaon and other commentators noted, the Mishneh Torah written by the Israelites on stone was not the book of Deuteronomy. So you see that it's a point that easy to make a mistake. Oh, they wrote the Mishneh Torah, they wrote the book of Devarim on the stones. Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon says, no. They wrote something that we call the Mishneh Torah, just like we call the book of Devarim Mishneh Torah, the summary, the laws, the Mitzvot, are also called Mishneh Torah. There may have been other authoritative Mishneh Torah. One such Mishneh Torah coming from priestly circles for the benefit of a future king is the temple scroll from the Dead Sea. That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that. So the Dead Sea Scrolls has what was called the temple scroll. I'm reading the footnote. Footnote 22 on page 165. Yigal Yadin. He was a researcher who studied the Dead Sea Scrolls. The principal difference between this Mishneh Torah and the book of Deuteronomy is that the latter excludes the laws of purity, sacrifices, and other rituals connected with the temple. So the book of Devarim doesn't have too much information on the laws of Tumah and Tahorah, the laws of the Mesorah, the laws of the Korbanot, right? Things to do with the Bet HaMikdash. These laws, as opposed to the temple scroll, which did, right? These laws were the concern of the priests, not of the king. Interesting, that's why it's called the temple scroll, because the temple scroll emphasizes that which is important for the temple, for the Kohanim and the Bet HaMikdash, namely the laws of Tumah, Tahorah, the laws of the Korbanot, the laws of the Bet HaMikdash. So it's also a Mishneh Torah. I mean, it's summarizing different laws, but it represents a Torah in that sense, right? Very interesting. Finally, it should be pointed out that according to the rabbis, The Mishneh Torah in Deuteronomy 17:18, right, when it's talking about the king, that he should write for himself a Mishneh Torah, V'chatav lo et divrei Torah hazot, V'chatav lo et Mishneh Torah hazot, I'm sorry, right? Must be explained as a double Torah in the sense that the king must have two copies of the Torah. So now you would say, well, okay, so if it says V'chatav lo et Mishneh Torah hazot al sefer, he should write a summary of the Torah. Goes against the Rabbeinu Satei Gaon. The Rabbeinu Satei Gaon says Mishneh Torah means a summary of the Torah. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is the king has to write the full Sefer Torah. How do you explain that? Again, I understand Rabbeinu Satei Gaon in the book of Yehoshua. I got it. I understand Rabbeinu Satei Gaon in Parashat Ki Tavo. Got it. I understand why we disagree humbly with Ibn Sargado Gaon, of course, Be'alavai, with the Yitzchak Abal Banel. But here it says, V'chatav lo et Mishneh Torah hazot al sefer, milifnei hakohanim halviim. Here it's Mishneh Torah because it's the second Torah he writes. He has to write a regular Sefer Torah as a regular person, and he has to write Mishneh Torah. So for him, it's a Mishneh, it's a repetition in the sense of Sheni, the second one. There's a first one, and there's a second one. And that's why it says, Milifnei hakohanim halviim. It says, don't make a mistake and think here by Mishneh Torah, I mean a summary of. It's not a summary of, right? And that's why it's Milifnei hakohanim halviim, bring out the Sefer Torah from the Aron HaKodesh, because this isn't the summary, right? It's a second Sefer Torah. You see that? It's amazing. Like, you know, when you study language and you study words and how your words are used in the Torah, and it's so context bound, right? Without context, you can't understand words. All right, getting back to the text. Okay. So Rabbi David Kemchi observed that a Mishneh text is conceptually related to the duty to repeat Vishinantam. So we have Vishinantam levanecha, repeat it. It's the same root, Shin Nun He, Mishneh Torah. Vishinantam, to repeat the Torah to the younger generation and to speak about V'dibarta bam, speak about the text that you're transmitting. A duty involving repetition of the Torah and its explanation in a general way. This is the footnote, note 23. Okay. According to this prescription, the Torah must be communicated not by reciting the original, but through repetition, by changing the original into a text that may be adequately repeated and thus grasped by the younger generation. You change it. That's why it says V'dibarta bam. You understand the subtlety? Chas v'shalom, we don't change the actual text of the Torah. Okay. But that's why it says V'dibarta bam. How do you change, quote unquote, the text of the Torah? By not actually changing the words, because how could you possibly change the words, right? The words of Mei Hashamayim, right? V'dibarta bam. You see how V'dibarta bam is the explanation. Vishinantam levanecha. Shinantam literally means to repeat the words of the Torah, but it also implies change. How can you possibly change the words? V'dibarta bam. So speak, and when you speak to your child, you're speaking in whatever language or whatever idiomatic expressions, and according to the mind of the child, right? It's fantastic. Wow, I don't know. Like I'm like it's just such a chidush to understand the meaning of these words and the meaning of the pesukim. So again, I'm just saying it again because I just want to make sure, like I want to know it and I want to make sure you got it. So you repeat the text, you say it, you repeat it. But shinantam implies shinui. How can you possibly change the text? V'dibarta when you explain it. That's the change. By changing the original into a text that may be adequately repeated and thus grasped by the younger generation. If the intention, my father here is quoting, I think Ben Amozek, if the intention of this commandment was a verbatim recitation of scripture without any additions or omissions, using the same expressions and vocabulary. You cannot possibly have said, and you shall repeat them and speak of them, right? Observe Ben HaMoseg. This is not what's called repetition and speech, but reading. If the intention was not to change anything, right? Just give him the blank text and there's no possibility of progress. The karata, bam, all right? The karata, et devarim ha'ele. Read it. That's what reading is. It says v'shinantam, v'dibarta. So you change it through the explanations that you offer, which are geared towards that generation, towards that child, towards his intellectual capacity. Speech, debur, is that which people communicate orally, not in writing, says Rabbi Eliyahu ben HaMoseg. It is Em Lamikra. This point becomes clear. I'm looking at the footnote upon considering that in Hebrew, such a recitation should be designated Koreh Be'al Peh, reading from memory. So Koreh is to just repeat the actual words in the original without any change, right? But we're saying we read a lot today. That would be it.